Saudi Arabia and Iran are now in almost open combat. Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. Is it possible for there to be any lasting détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran under the current regime?
Not under the current regime, that's for sure.
So never can't do it.
Look, the minute the regime took over in Iran, Khomeini's first word was to challenge the legitimacy of the Saudi royal family to be the custodians of the holy mosques. It was a challenge that was issued back in 1979. At first, the Saudis didn't do much. The pilgrims were coming to Mecca. They had to pretty much downplay all the sort of animosity or aggression until recent years, and particularly the last couple of years, where I think the gloves are now visibly off. What led to this? This whole attempt by the Islamic Republic to impose a regional hegemony under a sort of a Shiite modern-day caliphate was what provoked the Sunni bloc to respond to that, led principally, of course, by the Saudis, but many of the other countries in the Persian Gulf region. From Bahrain to the UAE, and of course what's happening in our neighborhood in terms of Iran's constant instigations of problems in its proxies. De facto, the Tehran regime now probably, we could say, controls at least 4 of the capitals in the Middle East, including Iraq, of course. It's presenting a serious challenge. Not just the Sunni Shiite conflict, but basically this entire war of hegemony. Oddly enough, for all of you who have followed Middle Eastern politics, it's the first time that I can recall that the position of Israel and that of Saudi Arabia is as close as it could possibly be. And they have the most criticism of foreign policies in the West, particularly that of the US, and all of the fingers point most of the time to the regime in Tehran as being the root cause of all the problems we see in our region. Now that should be enough indications for all of us to see that the region understands the root of the problem. We didn't have a religious conflict in the region. Sure, you must have heard that Persians were not really enamored with the Arabs ever since the invasion back how many centuries ago, and there might be some nationalistic fervor on that, but let's be realistic. I think our region is set for an opportunity to have cordial relationship, have regional markets, have regional cooperation, which will be good for everyone, including foreign countries and their business interests, because my theory is very simple. If you have enough Saudis invested in Iran and enough Iranians invested in Iraq, and Iraqis invested in Egypt, and Egyptians invested in Jordan, and Jordanians invested in so on and so forth, you catch my idea. People in that region would demand stability first and foremost. It doesn't need to be orchestrated at government level. It would be conducive to more cooperation, more opportunities, more economic growth, more development. What stands in the way of that relationship? Those who stand to provoke animosity, instability, for still sheer purposes of political survival. If the Islamic Republic of Iran was a legitimate system that had entrenched itself, you'd be doing business with them 20 years ago. There wouldn't be terrorism, there wouldn't be radicalism, there won't be bombing and hijacking and all the mess that has been the domino effect of that philosophy, which takes us back to what I was saying earlier, this whole value clash. Iran, at the time, was a military ally with the pact that we had with Turkey and Pakistan, to give you an example. CENTO. A couple months ago, the Pakistanis were telling the Iranians, if you cross that line and antagonize the Saudis with what you're doing, you'll be dealing with us. We were partners yesterday. What changed in all this? We had good relations with the world. We didn't have a Sunni-Shiite conflict. But the regime in Iran started all this. They're the godfathers of that extremism, which has led us to the point we have. So the simple question is, if you remove the Islamic regime from the equation, we are back to the people. People who say, hey, I remember when I was growing up, I have witnesses in this room, those of you who are of my age, I'm 55 right now. When I was growing up, one of my best memories of my teenage years was the privilege I had to practice soccer with our members of the Iranian national soccer team. What was our national team? You had in them Iranians of different denominations, ethnic background, and religion. We had Armenians, we had Khuzestanis, we had Kurds, we had Azeris, we had Christians, we had Jews, we had Zoroastrians, we had Sunnis, Shias. We were Iranians. Nobody looked at each other funny by saying, hey, nobody cared whose faith you had or what ideology. That was the Iran I grew up with. We were all Iranians. Didn't matter who among us was Jewish or Christian or even atheist. This regime created an idea that either you think like us or you're not of us. This disenfranchising the majority of the people based on their sexuality, based on their ethnicity, based on their faith. And that trickled down and is now subject to all the madness that we see. So going back to the relationship in the region, not with this regime, hell no, not with this regime. But if we remove a regime that caused the root of the problem, it will naturally revert back to an environment of friendship and mutual interest of problems that we have to resolve. Education, health, environmental issues, you name it. We don't have time to bicker over, some overblown nationalistic rhetoric, which at the end of the day is not a very pragmatic approach to issues that we have to solve together. It's not an East-West issue. It's not an Arab-Persian issue. It's an issue of equality, of justice, of rule of law, of opportunity, of freedom and human rights. That's what it's all about. And I don't think the rules of the game would change whether you're in Cairo, in Riyadh, or in Tehran if it's left to the people. And that's going back to that point. I think, and I know this, I'm not just theorizing here, I know people of that region. I'm in contact with people of that region. I talk to Saudis and I talk to people in UAE or in Bahrain or in Egypt or in Jordan or Israel or Turkey or Pakistan, you name it. And I think the majority think like we do, like I do. It's just a matter of getting that opportunity to prove it. And we need to put that machinery into place. Some of it depends on getting a lot of support and have a long-term strategic plan as opposed to only calculating on short-term issues. We cannot resolve the problems of that region if we think short-term. We have to have a long-term strategy based on principles that will not change regardless of the circumstances. There are some core issues that we need to stick to. And I think it's a case in point as we speak, and tonight some of you, like myself, would like to catch up with the debates to see what's going to happen. I'm very curious about it because, let's face it, the foreign policy that this country will have, regardless of who ends up in the White House a few months from now, is going to be critical. And whether or not there's an understanding of what we're talking about, I think is key, and I hope to be able to convey as much as I can into that message to make sure that we are not missing a beat here. And I think at some point, well beyond sitting back and being passive about whoever are the decision makers, let them deal with it. I urge you to be involved. This dialogue has to be across the board. Today, we benefit from a circumstance that did not exist at the time I was growing up. I remember the first message I sent from Cairo after my father had just passed away with an old telex machine. You can hardly even find it in the Smithsonian this day and age. There were no cell phones, there were no Instagram or Twitter or what have you, or Bluetooth communications. Today, we have the means to communicate, to find out about each other. And by God, we better use that means to understand How can we be impactful? But that's very much to our point. I think if we dig deeper, we will see that the animosity is not between the people.
Let's talk about that, because one thing I know from my time in the Middle East is that nobody knows anything about people in the Middle East by watching television in the United States. What does the Iranian
That's the problem with reality TV, unfortunately. Yeah. The Housewife of Atlanta have better viewership.
You referred to the man in the street. What does, and I'll ask you to generalize here, what does the Iranian man in the street think about the United States?
They have a great deal of admiration because they know how life is here. And if they could bail out of Iran, it would be the first country they would like to come to, because they understand that in this country, when there is a guarantee under the Constitution of freedom of religion or faith or what have you, it's something that they are eager to have back home. They want to have America back in Iran and not to have to migrate to America because they can't live in Iran anymore. They appreciate the values, they appreciate the opportunities and the standards and principles that has made this country, one of the greatest democracies on the planet. And the problem is that they don't see that translate into the actual policies that U.S. governments have embarked on ever since the change that happened in Iran in 1979. Ever since the U.S. hostages in the American embassy, the whole paradigm shifted into, first, we can't deal with these guys, and then, well, some of them maybe we can talk to. But in this whole process, Iranians' citizenry, the man on the streets, was pretty much forgotten and not talked about. If you ask members of your own media who have to travel in Iran to report something, most of them will tell you that it's a conditional access. They're taken on controlled tours. They are not free to talk to whoever they want. Even if delegations of diplomats or, for that matter, congressional people want to go and travel there, rest assured that they won't have the liberty to talk to whoever they want to gauge the opinion on the streets. So there's a big part of the equation that is missing in the understanding and the read on the situation. But those of you who have gone in Iran on a casual basis as tourists or as a result of, you know what I'm talking about. You know how Iranians are, how open they are, how friendly they are, how hospitable they are. And in fact, the biggest proof of what I think the majority of Iranians have about the United States, in fact, occurred the very day of that tragic attack in New York and Washington on September 11th. While many of the countries that are supposedly your allies had people celebrate on the streets, Iran was the only country where people held candlelight vigil in sympathy and support for the victims of that horrendous attack. You have a regime that is hostile to you, but its people are not. And they will be able to prove it easily. Not just the US, mind you. Any country who appreciates and values. We have no reason to be antagonistic towards any culture or any country for that matter. Because as I said, we have been, long before America became even a country, long before Christopher Columbus even discovered the Americas, Iran was a natural melting pot in that region. I heard one of the candidates said the other day that about Jews during the Second World War, that nobody was willing to take care of them, or nobody was willing to harbor them. Well, let me tell you something. In modern day, it was not just back at Cyrus the Great's time that we helped the Jews rebuild their temples, and in fact, Cyrus the Great is the most quoted person in the Torah. But in modern days, during my grandfather's time, and later on during the Second World War, we had our Schindlers in Iran and diplomats who were given passports and refugee status to a lot of Jews that had to escape from Poland and other places. We have a huge community of Polish Iranians who are a result of those who had to migrate in Iran. Many of them were Jews from the time. So that's the relationship that Iran has had. When you hear Ahmadinejad in the UN talk about wiping off Israel from the map, that's not what the average Iranian thinks. If you go to Israel today, go and talk to Iranian Jews who live in Israel right now, and they'll tell you about what happened to them at the time. This is what Iran is all about.
If you were able to have this conversation between the United States government and your Iranian man on the street, what would the man on the street in Iran ask of the United States government?
Stop appeasing those who suppress us.
You believe that what you refer to as a nuclear agreement is a form of appeasement?
Well, let's elaborate on this. I took the position of supporting the principle of having a deal as opposed to no deal for the very simple reason that it eliminated an immediate military threat against my country. But it was definitely an incomplete deal. Not just because the deal in and of itself is practically only pushing back a 3-month window of nuclear capability to maybe a 12-month window, which is really not much to brag about. But what about every other aspect of what's involved there in terms of human rights violation and what have you? Now, some countries were extremely critical and sort of unwillingly had to come along in the 5+1 arguments. You can ask the French foreign minister who recently stepped down from his position as what he thought about this whole process. We can talk about the German chancellor who said as long as the human rights situation in Iran continues to be blatantly stepped upon, we have no interest in doing business with Iran. So some leaders, among others, have the stronger courage to come and call it what it is. We're not out of the woodwork yet. I mean, we have yet to see full compliance in terms of Iran meeting its end of the bargain based on what was called for in that argument. They have already violated some aspect of those inspections as we speak. Are they reliable? God knows. Does that mean we have to go back to a scenario of war? No, that's not what I'm suggesting. But what I'm suggesting that is in the meantime, as the regime is trying to catch its breath, as it's trying to regroup, when there was an opportunity to really bring them down to their knees, and unfortunately the current administration pretty much gave them a new lease on survival, we have to bring back that element that I was talking to you about, which is absent of those disconnections. There has to be far more engagement, not just in the sense of, well, we need to have a dialogue with the current system. No, but engagement in the sense of with the people. For the past several years, I faced a very hard time, not I alone. When I say I mean the movement that we represent. The current administration was so hell-bent on not provoking the regime by saying we're going to absolutely raise the red flag on anything that the Iranian opposition is trying to do, from fear that the regime will say, how are you trying to negotiate with us on the one hand, but you're supporting an opposition on the other? That's blackmail, that's intimidation. That's basically saying that their rules ought to be the rules of the game and not yours. Now, who in this world should have the moral authority to dictate on terrorists and a regime that has been the root cause of the problem, that their rules ought to apply and not that of the conventional world? But practically speaking, you tell me, whose rules have we been playing by? You tell me. Do you expect to have the results we want to obtain? Of course not. So that has to change. And unless this changes, we're not going to resolve the problem. I'm not talking about saber rattling. I'm not talking about invasion. I'm not talking about any of this. I'm talking about simply understanding that they have bluffed their way tricked their way, literally weaseled their way out. They're laughing their rear ears off the way they were managed to factor everybody in this. But you know what? They're not out of the woods yet. Now it's going to be one of the, maybe I could say positive aspect of that deal is that now the onus is on the regime. You know why? Because people will say, what's your excuse now? It's a little bit like the Castro regime. Oh, you know, the problem is because of the embargo. Okay, there's no more embargo. Now what? Now what are you going to do? What is going to be the results of all these unfrozen assets that may be back in the regime hands? Are you going to spend it to support Bashar Assad in Syria to crack down on his own opposition? Are you going to finance Hezbollah and Hamas and all the terrorist networks you have around the world? Or are you going to pay some well overdue salary of a factory worker or an engineer or a medical teacher in Iran, for instance? The people on the streets, the man on the streets is going to say, where is this money going at the end of the day? Are you spending it on us? Or are you going to spend it to your own survival and pocketing it within that mafia infrastructure that is so corrupt that anybody in Iran could tell you how bad the situation really is? In a way, it's an interesting outcome now because the jury is now out there witnessing and watching. So, in that light, I think that the way the situation is evolving, as far as the people in Iran are concerned, is what kind of a direction is the policy going to take from now on? Okay, you wanted to get that monkey off your back, you have. All right, now we have some kind of a deal. And the nuclear issue, mind you, is not the most important issue. Even if you ask Israel today, they say, okay, we got that out of the way. Not that they're satisfied with the result, by the way, as far as Bibi Netanyahu is concerned. But let's say at least it's not an immediate threat. Well, what about the other aspects of it? Has it stopped Iran interference in the regional countries? Has it changed any of the circumstances of them having their fingers from Iraq to Lebanon to Syria today? And their silent partner being the Russians, where according to the foreign minister and the defense minister in France saying 90% of the shelling of the Russians is not even hitting ISIS, it's hitting the moderate opposition to the Bashar regime in Syria. What are we talking about here? So these are the kind of questions that I hope those who are scrutinizing, who ought to know better, will factor in. The only factor that I would add to the equation that has been non-existent, at the risk of being repetitive, is you have to factor in the people of those countries themselves. Very little has been done to acknowledge them, to engage with them. And I would like to ask a very simple question. I would ask this from whoever is in a position of authority and decision-making. As a member of the Iranian opposition, someone who obviously is fighting the current regime in Iran, I have never, ever asked any foreign government, America, France, Germany, you name it, to cease and desist from having a dialogue with the current regime. I understand the need for it, but I'm asking a simple question. What keeps you from having a legitimate line of dialogue with the opposition? Why wouldn't you have it? How could you expect to have better answers to understand the picture by not talking to the majority who is not being represented and expect to have a true picture of what's going on? Because we happen to be your best allies and we've been completely ignored. We've been completely unengaged. So when I mention appeasement, it's in the sense of not just because too many carrots have been involved and not enough sticks in one way, but because those who can bring real change have been completely taken out of the equation. And we can't change things by miracle. We cannot sit there and hope for the best without having any tangible means of implementing change at the street level. And if change was to happen, it's going to be at the street level at some point. Significant changes has happened throughout history in countries ultimately at the street level. The concept of the civil rights movement may have come to the minds of people like Dr. Luther King, but it did not happen until the marches started from Selma and so on, until finally that issue was resolved or brought to the forefront. I believe in people power, and I think at this point, if change was to happen, it has to be at the people's level, and how could you possibly not engage with the people? To this day, I cannot understand the rationale of saying, well, we don't want to upset the other side, we're trying to negotiate something, and they will blame us from talking to their opposition while they are conducting dialogue with them. You know what I call this? Blackmail. To this day, the regime is saying people should come and vote. And a lot of people want to not participate in these elections. I've called for that. I said not voting is a vote by itself. But there are some people who have no choice, not because they want to vote, but because they've been blackmailed. They are office employees, they are government employees, and if they don't vote people, they'll be out of a job. If you're a student and you don't vote, you won't be able to continue your studies. This is sheer blackmail. This is what you're dealing with. They're not playing by the same rules. So that has to change, whether it's at government level or all the way down. And that's the biggest missing element and the reason why the status quo has prevailed, in my opinion.
Let's do one thing. Your answers are a lot longer than my question.
I'm sorry, I've been long-winded.
We promised some questions from the audience. Let's take a few, and then we'll let everybody go home. But is there a microphone? How are we doing this? There is a microphone. So if you want to ask a question, if you would stand up and introduce yourself and then ask your question, that would be great. There's one back there.
The countries,
Can you use the mic?
yes, the countries surrounding Iran, Pakistan, Russia, Israel, have nuclear weapons. If you were the de facto Shah, not just the de jure Shah, wouldn't you want to have nuclear weapons also if the other countries around it? And what is the realistic hope of us keeping in the long term Persia from not having nuclear weapons? It just doesn't, I don't see the logic of us being able to, in the long term, keeping such a powerful civilization, powerful country, who is surrounded by countries with nuclear weapons, from having them themselves.
Well, I'm completely against nuclear weapons for the simple reason, and there are several, that first and foremost, I think Iran benefits from a natural advantage in the region in terms of its strategic depth, in terms of its natural resources, in terms of its polity. And by going nuclear in a military sense, we are opening the Pandora's box of everybody else committing to it, and we will lose that edge in terms of having an equalizer that will make us lose that advantage. That doesn't make sense in a strategic way. Back at the time that Iran was contemplating nuclear energy, some of our scientists went to my father and said, listen, we know the Pakistanis are building a bomb. Should we not consider developing a military program? To which my father answered at the time, what would be the point? Suppose we have a few dozen missiles. We're not going to be able to stop over 3,000 Soviet missiles, which was at the time, strategically speaking, the only real threat that Iran was facing. And as far as the only belligerent to Iran under Saddam Hussein, we were able to contain that by a conventional military. Number three, it cost a hell of a lot of money to maintain a nuclear arsenal, which in this day and age makes it economically unfeasible for Iran to even go that route. And well beyond just the military aspect of it and contributing to the proliferation issue rather than reversing that, I'm thinking that as an Iranian citizen, forget about all that patriotic or nationalistic rhetoric. Will I feel comfortable sleeping at night knowing that half a dozen countries in the region that are not quote-unquote democratic have potentially a missile aimed at me? Would I sleep better at night? Because that will guarantee, if we were to build an arsenal to have everybody else do the same. That doesn't make sense, does it? And even on the civilian aspect, I have a lot of questions of whether or not today it is feasible for Iran to even go that route. Iran is a natural country for renewable energies. Solar is being one. we could be a net exporter of solar energy, enough to cover, and in the meantime, in transition, I think Iran has enough natural gas to provide us with the necessary transitional energies until we can go in a different path. Iran is a seismic country. We don't have too many regions that are low in population with access to water to sustain a serious plan and depends on which technology. Japan had the best technology, and we saw what happened about 4 or 5 years ago. We're dealing with Chernobyl-level technology right now. Are we going to rely on that? So, you're opening a can of worms talking about nuclear with me, but I tell you that I have no reason to justify that it is in Iran national military defense to go nuclear. We'll end up having far more problems going that direction than skipping that and hoping that so far as Pakistan and India are concerned, and whatever acts they have to grant between themselves, that's a pretty much isolated issue. And tactical nuclear weapons that Israel has in self-defense is not a military threat to Iran, and Iran's relationship with Israel will be back to normal once the regime changes in Iran, so we don't even have to go that direction. And most of the countries in the Persian Gulf, we know that they can have a reliable, solid, friendly partner in the neighborhood as opposed to watch each other's move on our military advances. Because I think we need to expend most of our resources to what is sorely needed in terms of social needs and what our societies will have to be able to benefit from. I'd rather have Iranians have free education and free health and no nuclear missiles than the other way around, if you ask me.
Let's tell you what, sorry, but let's take one more. And we're sorry we run over tonight, but I hope you've enjoyed the remarks. So one would be fine.
Yeah, Helmut Ludwig, I would like to come back to your point before, Sunni Shia. You mentioned in the current status, hardly possible to have their coexistence. Still, that's the current status. What would be, taking into consideration the current regime in Iran and the leading family in Saudi Arabia, what would be your way going forward for potential coexistence, or what would be your recommendation for the Western nations to support there?
Well, look, my vision is very simple. Among other things, we're talking about a secular political system that offers people equality under the law, irrespective of their ethnicity or religious denomination. I will start at home. The best example to prove to your neighbors and to the rest of the world how you would deal with them is how you deal with your own citizenry. Iran is a mosaic of people of different ethnicities and religions. We have been like that for centuries. As I said earlier, we had Iranians that lived side by side as Christians, Zoroastrians, Jews, Muslims, Sunnis, Shias, and what have you. And it was never an issue who had which faith until this regime took over. This is a regime that made people start thinking about whether you are Kurd or Baluch or so on and so forth. Iran, back to its natural element, is a diverse, multifaceted mosaic that for centuries lived side by side in a natural way. We were a natural nation state for centuries. And on that note, let's not forget that half of the existing countries in the Middle East, with all due respect, were not natural nation states. Some of them only appeared on the map less than a century ago after the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire. But Persia, or modern Iran, has been around for almost 3,000 years, if not more. And it might have shrunk in terms of an empire that once grew quite wide, but whatever remained of Iran, or modern-day Iran, has been a mosaic of all these cultures. When the rule of law, when the law of the land, when the next constitution, that hopefully will be based on the principles of human rights, will guarantee all of our citizens, regardless of their political ideology or religion or ethnicity, equality under the law, when there won't be any discrimination whatsoever, when men will have and women will have the same rights, then the neighbors will look into it and say, why would they treat their own citizens of different faiths the same way but have a different attitude vis-a-vis us? We don't want to be belligerent. We want to, in fact, plant the seed of a standard of behavior so that modern days democracies have a reliable friend and ally in that region, help disseminate that message. Iran can be that. The Arab Spring was inspired by the Green Movement in Iran. Let's not forget that. Iranians, despite this regime, send a message. And I think Iran can be the country that could be the epicenter of that change. Everything started with Iran in 1979. And everything can go back to normal by Iran changing this time in the better direction. So I have no doubt whatsoever that the minute this regime is gone, and as soon as we can implement what's part of this vision, not only will be serving the best interests of Iranian citizens, but it would have an immediate impact in our relationship with our neighbors, particularly the countries that are immediately in our neighborhood, and of course, well beyond our region.
Thank you very much.
As a special thank you and recognition for your presentation and being here with us tonight, I'd like to present you with this Tiffany bowl. It's inscribed with the logo of the DCFR and today's date as a remembrance of your presentation to us. And we want to thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll take a photo now.